All right, very good, everyone. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulihi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I want to welcome everyone back to our seminar series that's being presented by ICB Wayland in conjunction with BIS and BIS faculty. And, we're so privileged to have with us Professor Amin Asfari today. We'll go into that in just a moment, but, if you see these links, please feel free to share them with anyone. They don't have to be from the ICB Wayland community. We're welcoming everybody because this is an opportunity, inshallah, for ilm, for us to kind of learn from each other, and especially from this distinguished faculty. So, inshallah, if you get this, please feel free to share it. And so Dr. Amin Asfari is coming us from Regis University. And it's really going to be, I think, a very interesting discussion that, inshallah, we'll have today. We're going to be talking about the role of Muslims in the West and media representation and bias. Clearly this is something that's kind of going on. And, the topic is from outsider to constituent belonging and making an impact. And I think that at this time, with everything going on, we're really kind of, as a community, beginning to think about how can we individually and as an ummah here in the United States begin to make an impact, especially with what we're seeing and kind of how our voices are, sometimes we feel not being heard. So I'm really kind of intrigued to see what or how Dr. Asfari is going to kind of educate us today. He's got a really interesting background. He's born in Kuwait, grew up in New York City. We won't hold that against him. He moved to North Carolina. He's taught at various colleges and universities. And he actually is working in the criminology department, which is kind of his real area of expertise. He has research and publications on interdisciplinary and journal articles, on this thing with Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, the white supremacy, including mass shooters and conspiracy theories, and as well as victimization in correctional institutions. So kind of a really kind of different background from our usual shuyukh. So we love to have that here at ICB Wayland. What we have is we have a very kind of a professional set of people community who comes to the center, and something like this I think would be of great interest to us. We'll archive it and people will be able to kind of come back to it, inshallah. So I'll give you the floor, and jazakallah khair again for gracing us.
My pleasure. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Brother Faisal, and thank you to the organizers at ICB Wayland, and thanks to the colleagues at BIS. When I was approached about this, among the things that I had worked on is assimilation, first, second generation, trying to understand where we are today in the U.S. as Muslim communities broadly, and how we're viewed. You talk about criminology and the criminal justice system as a sort of periphery of my work has dealt with assimilation and such, but yes, I'm concerned with hate crimes, how we're viewed as victims. Importantly, I want to note that some of my studies look at how we function within the criminal justice system, not as perpetrators of crime, because post 9/11, that's how we've been seen. We have been studied extensively, and federal funds have flowed extensively to research centers and think tanks to investigate the Muslim subject as a suspect. I want us to reorient our lens and our understanding of who Muslims are and what they contribute in the modern world, and certainly in the Western world. And in that sense, I want to position this brief discussion in the following way, offering some self-criticism. And I hope that you will take this self-criticism, that we will collectively take this self-criticism with an open mind, understanding that I am not here to attack us or to belittle our efforts, but to be genuine in offering a critique. I think, I don't recall the person's name, but someone once said that the critic is the most optimistic person in the room. That is to say that they are not satisfied with merely the status quo, perpetuating the things that have happened and continue to happen. They look to a future that is different. And when we talk amongst ourselves as Muslims, and we talk about the mujaddideen, people who come and bring new insights and new perspectives to the faith and the faith community, both culturally, socially, theologically, and otherwise, we often don't reflect on what that means. That means coming with self-criticism and critique. And oftentimes, because we tend to be more insular, unfortunately, we take that as a threat to our person, as a threat to our personality, and as a threat to our collective sense of consciousness. And I find that deeply problematic. So in my title, you see from outsider to constituent. There's a historical narrative that has to go on here. When I talk about the outsider, I'm talking not so much about the physical outsider, that is to say, the Muslim that lives outside of the West, but the Muslim that is in the West that does not see him or herself as a part of the West and the body politic in the West. This is not just the individual, but the institution. Let me give you a little background for those of you who may not know. In the 1960s is really when you see the first waves of immigrants, Muslim immigrants from Muslim nations coming to the US, what we would historically refer to as sort of brown countries. Because of exclusionary policies in the US and seeing these individuals as inferior, and there's a whole history there. Now, what these individuals did is they started organizations much like the ones that we're conversing in now. That is to say, mosques, and to some degree, although to a much lesser degree, Islamic seminaries. Those are really a new phenomenon. And I say mosques and not Islamic centers for a reason. Mosques are insular places. They were established to maintain identity. They were established to protect identity. They were places of worship. They were places of acculturation. So oftentimes the racial composition of an institution dictated the kind of culture that existed in that institution. So if you were a Desi, if you came from a Desi background or a Middle Eastern background, etc., you would note that the environment in that institution was really more about protecting that kind of culture and background. And that is not inherently or intrinsically problematic. It only becomes problematic when it blinds the group and the individuals subsequently within the group to the responsibility that they have in their new environment. One can say that I'm making the claim for assimilation. One can argue that no, assimilation requires, indeed mandates, that we leave behind everything and we simply blend in to the new, among the new constituents. I would suggest to you that I'm making the case for a strategic, not so much assimilation, but integration. Integration here being that we find ourselves as Muslims, we develop a strong Muslim identity. And that's a very nuanced word and phrase in and of itself, which we can certainly tackle later. We develop that strong Muslim identity, but we now see ourselves as constituents in the community in which we reside, and that we are responsible to it. What we see today in the sort of the discussion around the Palestine issue is we see a lot of activism coming from allied communities, Jewish Voice for Peace, a lot of liberal leaning organizations, members of the Black Lives Matter movement, Hispanics, Native Americans, Aborigines in Australia, and First Nations in Canada and such. But among the Muslims, we see much of the activism, not entirely, but certainly much of the activism arising from second and third generation Muslims. But they are reactionary. Despite the activism, which is light years away from where it was in even the 1990s, they're still reacting to policies that are put in place, reinforced, and pushed by Zionist agendas, by political members of the political class on both the conservative and liberal side of the spectrum, who have revealed themselves, frankly, to be no different than one another, two sides of the same coin. What we don't see by and large, with the exception of maybe Dearborn, Michigan, is that the Muslims themselves have developed policies, are contributing to the discussion at a high level, not coming here sort of begging and pleading for ceasefires or begging and pleading for for some changes or breadcrumbs, as I like to call them, from the political elite class. No, they are by and large reactionary. That is a byproduct of institutions which have failed to understand their mission in the United States and in the West, because they wanted for a long time to maintain an identity. In order to make an impact, when we think about where we move in the US or in the Western world broadly, when we think about our trajectory in life, generally speaking, with few exceptions, we move into an area and we look for economic opportunities. We look for good schools. We look for opportunities for ourselves in terms of enhancement and so on. How many of us, when we go to an area, even if it's for a short period of time, decide to participate in public civic engagement vis-a-vis, I want to run for local mayor, I want to run for school board member, I want to run for town commissioner, etc. You see, when the activism that's going on now, if you look at most of the council people across various municipalities, most of them, by and large, most of them, you can separate into two, perhaps potentially three, predominantly white, to some extent African-American, right, depending on where you're looking, and to a smaller extent, perhaps Hispanics, because they view these problems as their own. The social problems, yes, there may be self-interest, no doubt, and fundamentally, when we talk about assimilation or integration, we're talking about power dynamics, understanding that there are high power groups and low power groups. And our position, when we talk about power, it's not that we lack financial power, it's that we invest our financial power in institutions that have failed to assist us in moving the needle forward politically. So we build mosques rather than building, for example, universities. We build, Islamic centers rather than building hospitals, rather than building something that is comparable to APAC, right? These kinds of organizations that are well-versed, steeped, that would develop scholarships and send students into these various fields. By and large, again, as a byproduct of a largely immigrant community, what we want is we want to have our kids become doctors or engineers. I mean, this is sort of the dichotomy that exists in the Muslim world. Let me give you an example of our disconnect here in the US. Remember, I said there's a distinction between a mosque and an Islamic center. In the literature, if you study these things, Ihsan Begbi studied, he's a sociologist, a colleague who actually lived in North Carolina for some time, studies mosques, that's his specialty, studies Islamic centers and Muslims broadly speaking, right? So assimilation patterns and such. And in the literature, if you study these institutions, there's two differences. A masjid is generally the board or the ruling group, if you would, is generally constituted by immigrants, first-generation immigrants. If there is a board, typically it's imam-centric. The imam wields a lot of power. There might be a board, but generally speaking, you're going to find first-generation immigrants. The imam himself typically is going to be sort of imported from overseas. That comes with implications. That comes with a lack of understanding context, generally speaking. And what that means is that center is seen in the literature as a place of acculturation, a place of making people like back home, right? Raising your kids like back home. An Islamic center, however, generally the imam, you'll see them being American-born. You will see them well-versed in the culture. See, it's important when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something to the effect of, and we sent you with في لسان قومك, the tongue of your people. He's not here referencing the actual language, right? Language is one thing. Someone from overseas can understand the language. It's the cultural nuance that's important. So when someone says, "Oh, stop pulling my leg," there's a cultural nuance there. We know what that means. Or go break a leg. One can understand the English language and take it literally. Oh, I'm not going to break your leg, or I'm not going to break a leg, right? So literalism versus understanding context. Context means understanding history, the social history. Why, for example, as I was telling my students, the history of punishment. Why do we punish? Who was punished here historically? Is punishment because of crime? Well, no. Punishment was the power dynamics that we talked about. So the Protestant majority saw that Catholics were coming into the country in the early 20th century. Well, they used the criminal justice system to go into the bars and the pubs and to understand what is it about these groups? What do they do that we can criminalize? Well, they found that they drank excessively, right? If you were Catholic, Italian, Irish, whatever, you drank. So they passed the prohibition, not because they were concerned with the benefits or the health detriments of alcohol, but because they wanted to wage a war against the new immigrant group. Fast forward to the 1980s, and the same holds true with Blacks and Hispanics, right? The war on drugs appears, not because whites weren't consuming drugs, but what kind of drug should we criminalize that is being consumed by the group that we can then criminalize them and kill them off civilly? So I think that's important, right? So I think the problem for us was that we don't understand these contexts. And let me refer back to my example. An imam who I encountered from another state came to visit us here in Colorado. And he was shocked, right? He loved, of course, the mountains, as everyone does, but he was shocked with the level of homelessness, the people that are unhoused that are here. It's excessive in Denver. I want you to pay attention to his remark. His remark was, why all these homeless people, crackheads? Okay, I want you to pay attention to that. This is a person who heads, by and large, a significant institution in size and in membership. That kind of mentality is similar or is akin to the conservative, who is often mocked in Muslim circles for saying something that they worship Jesus, or that they, attribute divinity to Jesus or some such thing, and while simultaneously despising the poor. See, in the context of this imam's statement, he has shown that he does not believe that he is responsible for that social problem. He sees himself as outside of that social problem. And in so doing, any programming that happens in that institution is going to be seen as, well, it's us and them, despite the fact that he heads a large institution with large membership. That messaging comes across very, very potently. And the children that attend these institutions see this hypocrisy. That is to say that we live here, we reap the benefits of living in a superpower, and we fail to recognize our responsibility to the people who live here. If in fact the argument is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent you to mankind to better their circumstance and their situation, then it's incumbent upon you to do so no matter where you find yourself. Our institutions are not sending that message clearly. And so that hypocrisy is apparent. And what that leads to, fundamentally, is oftentimes that second and third generation is completely detached from these institutions. And then these institutions turn around and say, why are these children leaving? So it becomes a practice in self-aggrandizement, or trying to justify one's position, finding relevance for the institution. So what they end up doing is what? We need to hire more youth directors. We need to, not recognizing that part of the problem is in fact the messaging that's coming across. It's the things that are omitted, that are not actually said, that are deeply problematic. And so with that, I think I was told maybe half an hour or so. Generally, that's sufficient for an introduction. But you let me know if you want me to continue. I'm happy to do so along those lines, or I'm certainly happy to take questions at this point.
Dr. Asfari, I think why don't you carry on going, because you're laying a very interesting framework, and I'd like to see kind of where your argument goes. We're kind of 20 minutes into this, so
Sure.
perhaps you kind of dwell a little bit deeper for us on where you're taking this argument as relating
Sure.
to the issues that we're facing today.
Happy to do so. So the argument takes us to a logical conclusion. If what we've been doing is bad, if what we've been doing is not necessarily bad, but in the sort of pejorative sense, but if it's not wielding fruit, then the logical follow-up question is, well, what will? At what point do we begin to establish some foundations that are structural, that are meaningful, that allow us to see ourselves as members of this community, despite the fact that oftentimes members of this community don't want to see us as such, right? So it's not a surprise to anyone that Islamophobia exists, that members of the majority group would much rather have us elsewhere. I mean, that's sort of taken for granted. Thinking along those lines, again, some self-criticism by way of a little story. A colleague of mine who's a philosopher was telling me he was at another university, and he was saying that he had a Desi student who had really she had performed terribly in math and science and so on. The mother, the first generation, so mother and father are fresh from overseas. They came to the U.S. as immigrants, as many of our parents did. And they insist that this daughter become a doctor. Or else, the alternative is that she's going to go back home and get married. My colleague sat with them and said, what's going on? He didn't know the sort of the cultural issues that belie such a problem. So he was asking, well, what's the problem? Well, she has to become a doctor or else, right? So he said, okay, there are options. I mean, if she is struggling in that field, she can continue on in philosophy and excel in something else, potentially an engineer, or certainly, what do you think about a lawyer, her becoming a lawyer? Well, a lawyer is great. Good, fantastic. Well, typically, to succeed as a lawyer, one of the disciplines that you would take to take the LSAT exam and others would be philosophy. So she turned to her daughter and said, do you like being a lawyer? Would you be a lawyer? Yes, I would be a lawyer. Okay, good. Then if you're enjoying your philosophy class, you stick there, right? Otherwise, we're going to send you back home to get married. There's a lot to unpack in that conversation. Our understanding as an immigrant group of success is material success. Can you blame us for this? That's the first question. The answer to that is no. You've experienced colonization, war, continue to experience both of them, right? At the hands of empires that continue to exist. So it's not necessarily, I'm trying to understand and not justify. So we understand why most of our parents want us to become doctors and engineers. It's a sense of inferiority, and it's the need to have social acceptance within the group. And so what you often find is, my son is a doctor, my son is an engineer, and this is not unique to us. I mean, there are many Jewish jokes about this, right? The mother's ideal situation is, oh, my son, the doctor. Because of social status within our group. Remember, I said these institutions in the 60s were developed to maintain social cohesion. And so within that group, what you want is social status. And wealth is generally one of those things, and occupation certainly is highly correlated with wealth. The problem is that you fail to recognize that social status is not necessarily the measure of success. The measure of success for an immigrant group is successful integration as I've defined it initially. Because when we talk about power dynamics and wielding power, one class or one group wielding power over others, that success then is the ability to do the same thing, to counter that kind of power through the use of systems. You see, systems are developed and and used. So when we talked about the Irish and the Catholics, that system, the criminal justice system, is used by Protestants against them, against another emerging social group, Blacks, Hispanics. But to wield that kind of power, you have to enter into its underbelly. The Catholics who were facing the exclusion vis-a-vis the prohibition that we talked about wisened up really quickly. They understood that the way to social capital and the way to sort of move within this social structure is to enter into civic life. Civic life being civil service jobs, being teachers, being on the board of education, being police officers, being sheriff's deputies, entering into all of these various law enforcement agencies. And today, the NYPD and the Chicago Police Department, the upper echelon is largely composed of Catholic, Irish, Italian, whatever the case may be, because they wisened up and understood that that's the way that they're going to push back against the prejudice that they were facing. And so the case here for this girl that was a student, the mother did not understand. She wanted social status. She wanted a doctor or a wife. You're going to be a good mother or a good wife to someone, or you're going to be a doctor. In both cases, you lack agency. You as a woman, as a Muslim woman, are not your own woman. You are either the woman of your husband, or the woman of your children, or you're the woman of your parents. You're making us proud. In both cases, it had nothing to do with the girl. She had no autonomy and no agency. That's deeply problematic, and we need to think about that. So that's one aspect. The second aspect, Brother Faisal was asking me to elaborate a little bit. I want to talk about these institutions and some of the potential harms that they're engaging in, i.e. masajid, and to some extent Islamic centers. Recall that I said initially that I always reserve room for self-criticism, and I rarely speak to Muslim communities because I think I'm either misunderstood, misquoted, or oftentimes seen as an outsider, as if I'm somehow my intention is nefarious, or my intention is to simply break apart these institutions. And yet, at the same time, many Muslims will ask, brother, how do we fix our problems? Well, you don't even know what they are. And to do that, you have to ask questions. The problem is asking questions alienates you from the group. So allow me to do that if I may. With respect to Muslim organizations, I contend, and I just recently, I'm in the process of publishing a book on Islamophobia, a theory on Islamophobia, in which I dedicate a chapter with my colleague called Self-Hating Muslims. How is it that these institutions are creating, or part of the problem in creating, Muslims that hate themselves, that want to avoid the faith, if we understand the faith to be the social group? Let me start with a quote by Weber, the famed sociologist, Max Weber, in which he said, "Religion is the worship of your group," meaning that oftentimes it's about adhering to the group's norms. And once you leave the group's norms or criticize the group, then the group's idea and social solidarity and social cohesion, and that we're all brothers and sisters and one ummah, one body, etc., that deteriorates, and all of a sudden you find yourself excluded. Despite the fact that if you look at the prophetic tradition, that was not the case. In fact, it was the very idea of critique and criticism of the social group that made the Prophet ﷺ who he was, because he critiqued his group. And you notice what happened there. He was alienated, excluded. He was nefarious. He was questioning the practices of our forefathers. So masajid today, by and large, because they have been built on the foundation of acculturation and group identity, are culpable in benefiting from and creating Islamophobia. So I know that that's a very controversial statement, but let me suggest to you something. The existence of the military-industrial complex, vis-a-vis these bomb factories and the politicians that are bought by these bomb factories and vice versa, that then in turn support these bomb factories, benefit from the existence of war, do they not? becomes a business, a profitable one at that. In fact, these universities, with respect to the Palestine situation, if you know that some of these board members on these universities, they are members of Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and all these other companies. That's exactly why they're protesting, not because they despise Palestinians, I would argue. They could care less who's fighting, so long as they get to make money. It just so happens that we're sufficiently weak that we can be excluded because we haven't understood our position here. We are still the outsider, not the constituent. And so masajid create or perpetuate Islamophobia in the following way. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. If we think about what the Islamophobic message is, the Islamic message is bifurcated. It's two things, the Islamophobic message. One, Muslims are backward. And two, Muslims are violent. They've paid millions of dollars. You know, the report Fear Inc. that came out, what, in 2011, I think, detailed all the corporations, all the individuals, all the insiders, the brown people that helped perpetuate the Islamophobic narrative. In both cases, right, this is a deeply ingrained idea in the masses vis-a-vis media, and that's both liberal media and conservative media. If you're violent, imagine the following scenario. You take your young daughter, your child, to the masjid, or an Islamic school for that matter, and the daughter is not wearing the appropriate hijab. The boy is, has a T-shirt with a bunch of pictures on it, or is wearing shorts and some such thing, right? What's the first thing that they encounter? Violence from some elder at the community, maybe well-intentioned, according to a cultural understanding. This is haram. You can't be here. You can't do this. So they confront the child, right? Or they tell the kids, be quiet after salah, right? And then wondering later on why they leave the masajid. So they confront them with a sense of violence. And what you've done there is that child who is receiving the messaging from the Islamophobe has just internalized it about their group, that you are in fact violent because that was my interaction with you. Moreover, now the other one is that this group is Muslims are backward. They don't contribute anything to society, despite the fact that much of society's existence today, it rests on the back of Muslim civilization, right? So you go to a sermon by a sheikh who 90% of America's shuyukh, America's imams, are from overseas. And that in and of itself should be taken not as a blanket criticism. I don't suggest to you that by virtue of simply being from overseas that you're a bad person. Please don't misunderstand me. What I'm suggesting to you is you don't understand the context in which you live, the social milieu in which you are living. So you don't understand the social problems, nor do you understand the solutions aside from the copy-paste that you've learned from overseas, largely funded through a particular ideology and for particular ends, excuse me. So this kid is now at the khutbah and he's listening, or she's listening. And the khutbah is completely irrelevant to their life, completely irrelevant to their lived experiences. It is detached from reality, right? We're still talking about things that can easily be Googled because we don't understand context. In a time of TikTok videos that are, maximum of 3 minutes, when study after study has shown that our capacity to focus has significantly declined, our masajid insist on a 45-minute sermon, right? It is to fill the time. It is a job, it's an occupation, as opposed to how can I convey this message in a very articulate way, in a way that touches people's hearts and causes them to change. So I've experienced violence at this institution, and I've experienced backwardness, irrelevance, right? In both instances, Islamophobia has been internalized. And so the institution, unbeknownst to itself perhaps, has helped to create and perpetuate the Islamophobic narrative. They acted as the microphone. Those people were trying to get to that Muslim kid. They're not concerned with the white kid down the street. They're concerned with that Muslim kid to make them leave the faith. And you just help them do that. You just help them leave the group, if not the faith. And so then I said that these institutions help to perpetuate Islamophobia and to benefit from it. That benefit is now, once they leave the faith, you see that these institutions are now concerned with why are our children leaving? How do we get them back? We need to build more of this, more youth center, more, etc., all attached to the masjid as the umbrella, the socializing entity that we talked about. And thus it becomes deeply problematic, and it tries to find its own relevance and continues, and it's a cycle, pushing people out and then wanting to bring them in. It's as if the concern isn't so much the social problems of the world as Muslims are charged with. It's as if the concern for this institution becomes mere numbers, the idea of attendees, members in the community, despite the fact that do these masajid, and again, this is a blanket statement, I'm not suggesting there are none that do this, do these masajid step back and say to themselves, how are we relevant? How are we creating constituents rather than outsiders? And I will conclude with the following statement. Many masajid have awakened post 9/11 to find themselves as irrelevant. When these children began to leave, what did these masajid start to do? We're going to hold a blood drive. We're going to have a voting drive or whatnot. Unfortunately, by and large, too little, too late. Because for the child that's attending school, they have a blood drive at school. Their friend who's a Southern Baptist also has a blood drive at their church, or the synagogue has a blood drive. The idea of civic engagement is then also copied and pasted such that it becomes irrelevant to the child, because the things that the masjid does, every other institution in their life does. The university has all of the things that you're suggesting. We have blood drives, we have voting drives. In fact, this university here, to their credit, they took and housed homeless people here in their parking lot. How many masajid do you know giving their parking lots, with stipulations, providing doctors? God knows we have enough doctors in the community. Between every doctor and engineer, there's a doctor. How many of our masajid remain, empty between salawat or much of the day? And when I approached one of the Muslims here and talked about this, he said, well, look, they're criminal. Again, he doesn't see himself as responsible because, well, I'm Muslim. Well, these aren't Muslims. I don't really care, right? I'm neither Christian like them or atheist like them or whatever label they want to throw at these people, nor am I really American. But when it comes time to liberties and freedoms, I want my liberty. I'm American like everybody else, right? Well, if you're American, then you have to take on these responsibilities. You have to see yourself as an equal citizen. With rights comes responsibilities. And so I think these institutions have a long way to go. And I would suggest to you that it may not be these institutions that actually need to do what needs to be done moving forward. Does that help, Brother Faisal?
Yes, yeah, that's kind of interesting and kind of very provocative. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe I can ask you a question now, or are you drawing towards the conclusion, or how much more do you have to go?
No, I mean, that's, do I have to say the end, or, I mean, I suppose this is sufficient. If you'd like to open it up to questions and answers, that would spark some interesting conversation, no doubt.
Yeah, and I think there's a comment there that you can take a look at in the group, and I would kind of welcome anybody to, and it's good to have, I think it's good to be provoked and kind of have this thought. I think within our own community, there has been an awakening in the last, I would say, several months, going back probably to the time of the Muslim ban, that they should be civic engagement, and there are members of our community who have now been voted on to kind of high positions in several towns, beyond the school board, but as administrators. There's a mayor here who's Muslim, and actually a lot of them are all women, alhamdulillah. So I think they're leading the path in many ways, which is kind of interesting. where I was going to kind of push back on you was, this kind of aspect of, professionalism. And, what I think is that when a community first lands in a place, the numbers are relatively small and they don't feel comfortable enough to feel that, they have the wealth of the resources to say, we can do whatever we want. Our children can do whatever we want. And it's not so much social status as in, hey, you know what? I want my son to be more successful than I am. And he should go in a field that's stable and can essentially become a building block for a better life for him. And then he can use that to build the community. I am just the first generation, and they will then go on. And in fact, if we look at some other immigrant communities, like the Jewish community, for example, they started with doctors, lawyers, as you were saying, and then went into finance and, other fields, media, so on and so forth. And perhaps that's a model that is coming for us. Sure. Because our numbers are smaller. And if you look at other diaspora, like in the UK, for example, you are finding that the Desi community is going into law enforcement, becoming policemen and so on, because their numbers are much larger. Whereas here, our numbers are smaller, and in some ways that's not looked at as something that perhaps would be a profession that you should think about. So what is your answer to that?
I don't know that there was a question, actually, and I don't disagree. I think we are not exceptional in the sense that we are following other patterns as well. I think the US has a history of excluding minoritized communities. I mean, there's a great book, When the Irish Became White, understanding how the subtleties of those changes happen, how the idea of the Black criminal happens through the manipulation of census data, for example. And I think whether we like it or not, second and third generation, as you rightly said, are moving in that direction. I think where I would push back, I don't know that it's actually pushback. I think I agree with you almost 100%. I would suggest that we need to go beyond simply allowing for the children to go into these different fields to opening it up to them, or challenging them to do that and to excel. I'll give you an example. I take Muslim students back in North Carolina. I would take some of the students, actually they were at the masjid, and I would take them to the local university library, and I would tell them, look, I want you to do something. Go into the journals, the journal articles, right? The scholarly peer-reviewed literature, and I want you to see in the technical fields who the publishers are. And oftentimes these are members of minoritized communities, Muhammad Abu Saleh, Faisal Khan, and so on and so forth. You go into the social sciences, and you find very few exceptions to white names, right? Quote unquote American white names. One has to ask a question as to why that is. One has to also understand that there's historical precedence. My argument has been, if you look at the Muslim world, the golden age of Islam, you see that the golden age of Islam and the Andalus, modern Spain and such, they did not concern themselves with your theology. Maimonides came and did his work in Muslim lands. Ibn Sina, who some scholars, I'm not sure the veracity of these claims, would suggest that if you want to compliment him, Avicenna, that you would call him an atheist. They all came together to work, and the Muslim world benefited from their intellect. Right? The translations of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, these were done by the Arabs of the time. Under Muslim rule, despite the fact that many of them were not Muslim or were not Arab. But they can then say, look at what the Muslim world has produced in terms of knowledge. And so the US is the same way. The US comes and brings in these immigrants, and they publish and they have their intellectual treasure, if you would, they leave it here in the US and they produce things that perpetuate a capitalist system and the consumer economy and such and such and such. But what is the social world, and how do social beings function, and how do societies function? How do nation states function? What is psychology and such? That's largely the byproduct of whom? Of the social sciences, of humanities, the things that we would not enter because that doesn't wield money and social class and social status. And so I agree with you, Brother Faisal. I would suggest to you that we should not simply leave it to chance. But just as we encourage our kids and open their horizons and expand their horizons to the medical field and others, I say we need to do the same for other opportunities. Hey, have you considered this? What does this look like? What are the advantages to our group collectively and to you personally, right? If you look at the Department of Defense, Donald Trump came out and said that the UNC Chapel Hill and Duke University Muslim studies programs or Middle Eastern studies programs are framing Muslims very positively. We need to defund them, which is an admission of the reason for their funding to begin with, that they need to frame this group as an outsider, as someone who is other than, someone who is servile, someone who we can exploit, someone who we can study to understand and to subjugate. And so in that sense, what are our parallels? Why are we not entering into those fields so that we can understand society and understand the nuance of how the sort of the oppression against us is? I want to sort of just say one thing, if I may, just as an anecdote. If we study prejudice, there were two prominent books that came out. One in 1954 that said it was The Nature of Prejudice, understanding how prejudice how prejudice arises in the human psyche. And the second was The Functions of Prejudice. And The Functions of Prejudice by Jack Levin. He said, prejudice, aside from the pejorative sense of the word, I mean, we don't care if it's a bad word or not. He said prejudice exists as a social force in society. How it's used and to what ends is important to understand. So he said prejudice is not always up here. It spikes and it comes down, right? And so for us, we have to understand why. He said prejudice benefits the majority group in excluding minorities. But prejudice also benefits minority groups in understanding and connecting amongst each other and saying, hey, I'm excluded, you're excluded, who's doing this to us? How can we overcome it? And in so doing, I would suggest to Trump and his ilk that the best way to avoid having members of the LGBTQ community, members of the Muslim community, members of the Black community, women and others, if you don't want them to be fierce opponents, then leave them alone. Because when they face the prejudice, what they do is they connect the dots and understand that they're being socially excluded. And so they join forces to confront that prejudice. So in sum, yes, you're right, but also just as we tell them about the benefits of the medical profession, engineering, we should also expose them to other benefits of other fields. I'm sorry. I hope that helps. Forgive me for being verbose. I see several questions here. Brother Amin, thank you for this thought-provoking talk. My pleasure. I agree, some young Muslims may think that traditional religious practices don't address their current issues or feel connected to their daily lives. How can we foster a sense of belonging? Traditional don't address their current issues or feel connected to their daily lives. How can we foster a sense? That's a deep question. I'm assuming that's Sister Suad, if I'm not mistaken. I think of systems and structures. So I think the answer lies in understanding the problem. So you simply reverse engineer the problem, as I've told you, right? 1965, these institutions come to create identity, to solidify identity, social cohesion, etc. They bring in imams that do the same thing. Then you simply reverse engineer it. You bring in people that are American born, understand the American social dynamic and the social fabric. You bring in people who are talking about, the social sciences or the sciences or whatever the case may be, who are shedding light on issues that are fundamentally relevant to the experiences, the lived experiences of these children, but from a different light. And you see, masjids have because they need to find relevance. They need to be relevant to the Muslim community. So they always, the Friday night talk, Brother Faisal said in the beginning, he said, you're different from the typical shuyukh we have. That statement alone is telling, because it suggests that typically we have what? We have a religious bent on these things. But I would suggest to you that therein lies the problem. Since when was religion in the social world or the sciences a schism? The scholars that we hold up and revere were ones who studied philosophy, law, medicine, Arabic grammar, who studied all of these things. This is who gives us Plato and Aristotle and others. أفلا ينظرون إلى الإبل كيف خلقت? Do they not look at the camel, how it was created? I.e., why don't they have an interest in zoology? فلا ينظرون إلى الإبل كيف خلقت وإلى السماء كيف رفعت وإلى الأرض كيف سطحت, and how the heavens have been erected and how the earth has been flattened. In other words, astronomy, biology, geology. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encouraging us. So this schism is a false schism. And so you have these masajid bringing in the so-called religious folks to come in and talk to us about religion as though it was separate and distinct. And that's a historical problem. Once religion became a thing in and of itself, devoid of understanding of human psychology, devoid of understanding ecology, environment, and so on and so forth, then you had a problem. And so I would suggest to you, this schism needs to disappear. I hope that answers it. If I may, let me read this one. Thank you for this presentation. I'd like to follow that train of thought that Islamic centers in this country benefit from having leaders who have grown up in the West. This wasn't the case for our center until the last few years, and now almost all our board grew up in the US or Europe. What are some suggestions for better serving not only our membership, but our community at large, as well as helping the Muslim Ummah? I would suggest to you thinking outside the box. As I've just articulated, thinking about ways to incorporate all of these fields, all of these ideas, and not seeing them as somehow antagonistic to the faith. And you do that through this kind of engagement with guest speakers, with bringing in, it doesn't have to be Muslims, right? Bringing in specialists in their fields and having talks and trying to understand the human psyche and the human condition and the misery of human condition, just as the happiness of human existence. Thank you. I enjoyed the educating talk, important points. Thank you so much. It seems like we've run out of time, Brother Faisal, and I don't see any other questions. If you have any other questions, happy to address it.
Yeah, let me open it up to the group and see if anybody has something,
Sure.
anything that they would like to say. Inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair.
So I think with that we can kind of start to draw to a close. Brother Amin, I thank you so much. I think I really enjoyed that. It was kind of thought provoking. I think at our center, interestingly, we do draw on a lot of sciences, partly because we do have a professional kind of background, and alhamdulillah, we're trying to create a lot of this kind of interplay.
Sure.
That I certainly believe in. But I think that was an interesting take up on it, and take on Islamophobia. So inshallah, maybe we can kind of carry this conversation forward at some other time.
Inshallah.
And may Allah bless you and increase you with more of this thought-provoking research and the books you're doing, and may He also help the masajid to be more relevant to all of us, to our and to the youth that we're happening, and make us able to form institutions that inshallah will help the ummah here in America and around the world in the future. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Jazakallah khair. There's one last question just popping up right now. We can answer that and then close.
Do you have book reading suggestions? Oh boy, do I have book. I mean, depending on your interest, of course, I'm happy to leave my email there. And if Brother Ali would like to converse with me there, sure. I think it's important socially, if we're talking about the social world. I may have mentioned The Symbolic Crusade by Joseph Gusfield would be a good one, understanding the dynamics between Catholics and Protestants in the US. I think understanding the condition of other minoritized groups is an eye-opening experience to see how and where you are in the process of being stigmatized and alienated. Of course, naturally, my own book, I always shamelessly self-promote that. Jews and Muslims and the White Supremacist Conspiratorial Imagination. You can Google me and you'll find it. To understand why white supremacists who go in and shoot and kill people in mosques and synagogues, why they do what they do. Anyway, what I can do is I'll leave Brother Ali my, or I think you have to, Brother Faisal, or maybe I can here.
Yeah, you can leave it in there, inshallah.
Okay, I'll leave the email here, and Brother Ali, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to send you a lengthy exposition.
Jazakallah khair again.
Barakallah feekum. Thank you.
Everyone can use that email if they so wish.
Oh, of course, please.
And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, just so everyone knows, next week the halaqah is going to be in person, and when it's in person, we serve food as a enticement. So hopefully we'll see more of you, and then the seminar series will continue on a Wednesday after that, same time, 7 p.m. I hope that this time's not too early for everybody, but let us know if you think that it is. But the program next week will be at 6:30, given the food on Friday, inshallah. So once again,
so one correction. So the next Wednesday program is on not the Wednesday after. It's actually the following, I believe.
Yeah. You know, there may be a vacation week in between, but we'll send out on email exactly the date.
Yes. So
I think there may be a school vacation in between, which may be part of it.
So the next month of so February, the way I see it is the in-person session is on the 9th. So and then there is the 14th and the 28th.
Yeah, we'll communicate that. Yeah, it goes from Friday to Wednesday because it's virtual.
Right.
Inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallah feekum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you so much, and hopefully we can invite you at our center someday so that you can see something that you mentioned are happening, but so very slowly though.
Barakallah feekum. Jazakumullah khair. Thank you so much.
Wa alaikum
Assalamu alaikum.